Hello, fellow parents and educators. Thank you for joining me at Education Evolution, where we are disrupting the status quo in today's learning models. We talk about present-day education, what's broken, who's fixing it, and how. I'm Dr. Maureen O'Shaughnessy, your host and founder of Education Evolution and the Microschool Coalition, where we are fiercely committed to changing the narrative, to reimagining the education landscape and creating learning that serves all children and prepares them to thrive. Hi, Nate. So good to have you on Education Evolution.
Yeah, good morning, Maureen. Happy to be here.
Great. And listeners, today I'm chatting with Nate McClennen, Head of Innovation at Teton Science Schools in Jackson, Wyoming. I can't wait for Nate to share the impact of place-based education. Nate, let's start with a brief summary of place-based education and how this looks at the Teton Science Schools.
Sure. Well, thanks, Maureen. So place-based education for us is really about integrating learning directly into the community. And we talk often about learning ecosystems. So in traditional models of education, we've really restricted formal learning to the classroom walls and the school building. And what we define as place-based education is how do we really tap into the context, the local context, the local economy, the local culture, the local ecology, to allow students to build on prior knowledge and find relevance and meaning in the work that they're doing. So that's the context and the definition of place-based education. It really opens up this anytime, anywhere learning that we're trying to achieve in education as we try to personalize for all students. At Teton Science Schools, we are a 52-year-old nonprofit that's located in Wyoming and Idaho, and our mission is around transformative place-based education. So for us, we have a variety of program modalities, and we have a graduate program that students that are post-collegiate can go and to get a graduate degree in place-based education. We run our own pre-K through 12 school. We have a professional development center, and we run science and leadership programs at our campuses where students come and learn in our place here in Wyoming and Idaho. So for us, so much of it is about how do we get students to do real learning out in real places. And so just a few quick examples to get the audience thinking about what this looks like is that we at one point on our campus had a small sinkhole about 5 feet in diameter appear, and that turned into a larger project because it was emergent. The students saw it. The high school science teacher was studying geology anyway as part of their content standards, and they're able to tap in and actually create that as their project to investigate it, understand the subsurface, what was happening. And then the students found that experience was far more sticky than if the teacher had just talked to them about geology and done a few worksheets or lessons or labs. Another quick example is some of our middle school students partnered with a local children's museum. The local children's museum needed a demonstration or a exhibit on the human body, and they essentially contracted out with our middle school students who are learning about anatomy and physiology in their science classes, and also partnering interdisciplinary with arts, etc. And they created an exhibition for this museum, which had both parent displays and displays and interactive displays for the students. So those two quick examples as I give an overview of place-based for us.
I love it. And I like your expression, sticky, that I'm sure the sinkhole is something 20 years from now the kids will be talking about when most education is gone within 3 to 6 months. So that sounds cool. And also, I appreciate that our microschool lead prep has been on the receiving end of your professional development multiple times, including this spring as we're diving into some new interdisciplinary. So I love that you're not just living it, but that you're sharing it out with others. That's the way we're going to make change happen. So thank you for that, Nate.
Yeah, sure. And we, over the last 5 years, as you know, we've been really thinking about So thinking about sharing and learning in two ways. So one is sharing what we know, but also capturing the amazing place-based work that's happening across the country and the world. There are so many educators that are doing this work in their own classrooms in their own way. And in fact, I would argue that place-based education is the original form of education. All education was place-based prior to sort of the accumulation of knowledge and the disbursement of knowledge around the world. And so there are teachers that are doing this. And part of our work, we've created a network of schools primarily focused in the rural and public space, but we also have private partners and some in suburban and urban spaces that are really thinking about how do we codify this well, and how do we learn from each other, and how do we scale and accelerate the impact on students, because we recognize that we all can learn from one another, as you said, and there's a lot of opportunities, but we're all using different language. So part of when Tom, Emily, and I wrote our book this past year, part of that work was to help codify this field of place-based education that everyone is talking about. How do we get students to see the relevance, and how do we get students to increase engagement, especially as they go through middle and high school, because we see engagement levels drop so dramatically. And we believe that place-based education is a way to do that.
Absolutely. And I'm going to make sure to put links to your book in our show notes, that and to Teton Science School and to the work you're doing, because we can all benefit from the synergy you're creating with the network. So that is definitely appreciated. I'm wondering just if you could go a little deeper on this student agency. How do you hook kids in?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we have worked in all sorts of ways to make this happen. I think it's helpful if I just talk really quickly about our model and how we codify this. And so we have a couple different elements or sections of our model. So at the core of our model, what we call the framework, we have 6 core principles, which we've worked with your school around. And those 6 principles include things like inquiry and design. So inquiry, what the world is; design, what the world could be. Includes thinking about community as a classroom. How do we use the community as a context for learning, like we spoke about earlier? And then also this principle of local to global, sometimes referred to as global, but this idea that how do we understand local to understand global? And sometimes it's vice versa as well, as they'll see a global piece or a regional or national news item or a phenomena, and that is connected back to the local. And then the last 2 principles are around interdisciplinary, the work that your school is embarking on at Lead Prep, is how do we help learning mirror the real world? The real world's interdisciplinary, as we know, but in learning, we tend to segregate it by different disciplines. And that's a challenge for students, because they have to code switch between different classrooms and use different parts of their brain and different synapses firing, et cetera. And then finally, learner-centered, which ties into agency, is we believe that a deep shift needs to happen if place-based education is truly going to manifest itself in a way that makes sense and helps every student learn more and have more impact. Then we need to put the learner at the center. And so that means, how do we allow learner and student ideas to generate new projects? How do we help them, the context of their worlds, stimulate the learning that has to happen? So we recognize that most schools have to adhere to state standards. And what we argue is that how do you connect those state standards to student interests, context, and different cultural backgrounds, et cetera, so that the relevance increases. The students going to agency then feel like they have ownership over how those standards are mastered, or how they demonstrate evidence. And so this might look in our schools and the schools in the network as we're helping to grow this process, is that, in, say, a science class or an interdisciplinary science and humanities class, or whatever it looks like in your school, you need to cover certain content areas and certain skill areas. And the first step you do is ask students, what do you want to do? What do you wonder about in your community? What do you see in your own lives? And that helps develop agency so that every student can see that they can make a difference in the world. I think primarily, if I think about the long-term goals for this, is I think about agency as one of them, is every student, no matter their backgrounds, no matter their race, no matter their demographic, whatever the case may be, every student believes and sees that they can make a difference in the world. And that's not true right now. So I think that's one outcome. I think the second outcome is around community, is that every student feels like they're a part of a community. One of the things we've realized in place-based education has been written about extensively over the last 20 years, is this idea that everybody sees place differently. And you might have someone who believes that their place is the best place, meaning that they are totally supported because of the privilege that they have, because of the job that they have, because of whatever. And then someone else from a different perspective, a different background, different upbringing, etc., might perceive that place as totally different. And we're seeing that, of course, in the world right now. And so that ties into this third piece, in addition to agency and community, which is the third piece, is around equity, which is a theme in our book. And this idea of equity is that every student deserves to experience incredible learning. It's not just students that can afford extracurricular activities in the summer where they go have service learning experiences, but every student should experience that in their schooling, in their K-12 experience. It doesn't require extra finances, doesn't require someone to drive them somewhere, doesn't require extra time. And so when we think about those big themes, agency, every student feels like they can make a difference. Community, every student feels like they belong and are part of something larger than themselves. And then the third is around equity, is every student has access. So those are some of the aspirational goals that we think about a lot in place-based education.
Wow, that is so impactful. And I think equity is on everybody's radar right now, as it needs to be. And community and agency, absolutely. So let me be a naysayer. We seem to think in our U.S. culture that if a ninth grade student covers a ninth grade biology book, they've learned it and we can test them and we know they've learned. So how, if you give kids agency and if you're doing real world sinkhole experiments and stuff, how can you demonstrate, or how can the kids demonstrate without the textbook and the chapter at the end, that real learning is happening?
Right. So a couple big things here that are I think you are super aware of. But I always think about the way that people think about what is the written curriculum, what's the taught curriculum, what's the learned curriculum, right? And we're pretty good in the U.S. across the world about the written curriculum. Whether or not the quality is high, unclear, but there is a written curriculum. We spend a lot of time on the taught curriculum, meaning what are teachers, how are they translating that written curriculum into something that the students hear or experience. And then I believe, pretend to know what the learned curriculum is by giving very standardized assessments or things that are about basic recall or specifically focused on content, etc. So I think we are doing a lot of thinking about what does assessment look like, especially in these more these place-based projects. We wrap around in our model. So if you remember those 6 principles we talked about in the beginning, around that, we wrap 4 different what we call elements. So project-based learning, personalized learning, character and leadership, which for us is a social-emotional learning curriculum, and then competency-based assessment. And so we've really thought a lot about how does competency-based assessment allow for more authentic learning and authentic demonstration of learning, authentic evidence collection. And that might look very different from a traditional paper and pencil assessment at the end. And it allows students to truly understand what they were doing and demonstrating the outcomes that they needed to be demonstrated. So I'll give you another tangible example. In a school in Idaho that we worked with, an elementary group of students, they were learning about ecosystems and social structures, and they decided as part of their project, there was a local campground, and in that campground, a lot of the pedestals that indicated what site number was that existed, they're all falling down and rotten and just not in good shape. And so the students decided they were going to rebuild and beautify that system. And in doing so, they were going to actually add informational plaques along the way that talked about history and talked about ecology of this particular campground. And so their final projects were each student in collaboration with 1 or 2 other students had to create a visual display that was actually placed in the campground that talked about the history and the ecology of some aspect of that campground. They went and then installed those, and then they actually camped out at that campground. And this is a rural school that was able to access campgrounds. And so if you think about what is the learned curriculum there, so they will never forget the content that they had to go and actually saw that was visually displayed, but they actually also made something that other people will learn as well. So it became way more authentic, and go back to the word from the beginning, way more sticky than if they were just had to report on what is an ecosystem and how do food chains work and all those traditional things that students learn. And I want to be really clear that it's not to say that great place-based projects, great project-based learning, that requires really, really strong background content and background skills. So just because you have a really engaging project that the students like doesn't mean that they automatically learn. You have to make sure that they have the strong content to back it up. So there is sometimes more traditional ways to work on that content and develop those skills, which they then can apply in their place-based projects that are emergent and based on their interests and their sort of their passions, their connections, etc. So I think authentic assessment is really important for us. I think the world is rethinking assessment when we realize that it's really hard to assess the quality of a student's understanding simply by a set of numbers on an English language arts or a math standardized assessment. And I'm very curious after this COVID spring that we've had where no standardized tests were given across the country. What will that tell us? Will there be something that says, hey, we can move faster to alternative type assessments at the local level, regional level, rather than the more state level work?
Wouldn't that be something?
Yes, for sure.
Wow. So Nate, I know that kids are held accountable at the Teton Science School and that you use a lot of competency-based assessment. How does that look if it's not a chapter test? How are you assessing and how do we make sure kids have the skills and the background knowledge as well as can create that product that from their project? How do you assess?
Yeah, great question. So for us, that competency-based assessment element looks like a set of what we call domains that are broken up into competencies and then performance indicators. Each one of those performance indicators has a set of outcomes that are very much like standards that students would see across the country, or at least their teachers would see across the country. And the difference is one of the differences is in the competency-based assessment system is that those outcomes are the ones that stay consistent throughout a student's experience, let's just say K through 12 in the United States. And if you can imagine, it's a runway of content that the students need to understand. It's a runway of skills that they need to be able to show, and it's a runway of dispositions. We include dispositions as just as important. That might be the character work that they're thinking about. And so all students have the same high expectations for those as they reach benchmarks in, say, 5th grade or 8th grade or 12th grade, et cetera, if you're grade constrained. And what changes and what's variable based on the school and based on the individual student, if you're more in the personalized learning world like we are, and the place. So all those contexts can change the learning experience itself. So we have high accountability for the students submitting evidence against those outcomes. And the teachers are helping to facilitate that, and the students are helping to generate great learning experiences around that. And what we're doing is we're watching to see students to show that they are demonstrating proficiency on a set of outcomes that make up a larger competency that are collected into these larger domains. So we can see progress along a set of competencies across a multi-year learning experience, which has been really effective for us and really, really difficult. If we think about the hardest part of our place-based education model, the learning model that we've put out there for our network of schools and our own school, I think competency-based has been the trickiest because you're fighting against a paradigm of what has been traditionally thought of as traditional assessment, meaning you give quizzes, you give exams, they each have different weights, and then you average them together to get some single number. So our report cards actually, while we parallel single numbers and letter grades in the older students just for the time being, they can see what % of the outcomes they've shown proficiency on for any given competency. And then even what's more interesting is I was talking to one of our partner schools yesterday in Vermont, Mountain River School, and they are a small micro school, about a little bit smaller than your size, so the same sort of system. And they are really seeing students able to articulate which domain and which competency and which proficiency performance indicator they would like to cover based on the content that they are interested in. So it's truly emergent. They're saying, we want to study this, and we know which ones to link in in terms of outcomes, because in competencies and domains, because we know what we've done before. So they start to take ownership of filling the gaps of the content, the skills, and the dispositions that have not been filled in prior projects and prior learning experiences, et cetera. So that's been a really interesting evolution. And I would say also that most of our schools, including our own, still have a strong English language arts strand and a strong math strand. We don't integrate all those things into the projects at this point. And I think philosophically, personally, I believe that there's still skill building that needs to happen. Communication, sort of literacy in math and literacy in the English language. And for us, we have literacy in the Spanish language as well in our school. And so that those two are also connected to these long runways of content, skills, and dispositions along the way. So every learner experience counts. Some are more emergent and some are more skill building, say in ELA.
That's amazing. And with that multi-year perspective, kids really getting trained up so that they can actually say, with this project, here's what I want to be working on. Talk about agency and talk about getting to do something that in a traditional model, they would never have the voice to design which competencies they're working on when. Very impressive, Nate.
Yeah, it's been fun experience, and it's I think we have been really humble in the process of thinking about like the work that it takes to first get teachers to understand and say, what does it look like if students are in this progression of learning? And then once teachers understand it, how do we get students to understand it? And the basic building block is what a lot of schools are focused on right now. The basic building block is standards-based learning. So any learner experience that is more summative or that teachers want to record, they're going to link to the expected standards. And I think the big difference for us is that we're able to aggregate up into these larger competencies. So we're not caught up in this very granular level. We're really thinking about if you have, say, 30 outcomes in one competency, how does the student progress along a competency of writing across 13 years? And what does that look like? But really being able to have the students eventually, as they get older, own where they are. And so across multiple disciplines, across interdisciplinary work, so that they can see the writing they're working on in science supports the writing they're working on in, say, an English class, if it's still a school that has discipline or subject area classes. So yeah, we approach it with a lot of humility, and I think this might be a lifetime of learning, but we feel like we're really onto something. And there's a great movement out there right now. Everybody, probably I would say 5 to 10% of schools are out there really thinking about competency-based because they figured out standards-based and like, wait a minute, but we need one more piece. And for us, our model has to be unlocked with that, because if we think about learning ecosystems, and I'll take my own children, for example, who are now a rising 9th grader, rising 11th grader, who both like soccer, and in our area, they like backpacking and being outdoors. They should be able to identify the competencies and outcomes that are connected to that. So we have a domain called health and wellness. In that health and wellness domain, they should be able to connect that and say, oh, this counts. I'm going to document what I learned on this backpacking trip, or I'm going to document what I learned out on the soccer field. And that should be able to count, rather than saying, oh, no, you have to now go take a physical education class to repeat that learning. So if we're going to make everything count, if the ultimate goal is to say learning happens everywhere, which we know it happens, and we want to make it all count, we absolutely have to have a strong place-based approach and a competency-based assessment element to help support it. Those two things must happen together, I think, to have a full manifestation of this learner ecosystem idea.
I completely agree. And that makes wonderful sense. If you're out doing soccer and meeting competencies, that you have a way of recording it and getting credit for it, and that we acknowledge learning is everywhere and all the time and not just within those four walls. Nate, I have one final question for you. If you had a magic wand, what one way would you improve how learning happens, especially for our tweens and our teens?
If I had a magic wand, well, I think the one thing that I would do is eliminate the artificial constraints that we have created within a sort of a traditional model of education that we have been really pushing over the last 100 years. I think I would open up those walls, and so that students don't leave middle school, don't leave high school disengaged. When we look at the data, it's around 20 to 30% engagement levels in a huge number of surveyed high school students in the United States. And it's stuck like that for a long time. We have not been able to move the needle. And so my magic wand would say, all right, we're going to move that needle. We're going to have every student graduate with a level of engagement that's at 70, 80, 90, 100%. And in order to do that, we have to make learning relevant to that individual. We have to make it equitable for all students. We have to have them graduate feeling like I have agency and I can contribute to my community. And I can almost guarantee with that magic wand swipe that your data on student engagement, your data on student outcomes, long term, if college is in the works for them, long term college graduation rates or success in the workplace, all of those things would increase. And so we're missing that because of, I believe, the way that the learner experience, the students experience learning in their schools. They're going through, many of them are going through the motions. And so my magic wand would switch that with a change of learning experience, which in all my mini magic wands would say, okay, how do we help teachers do that? How do we help schools do that? How do we change the laws to do that? There's so many barriers that are in the way that we have to work around. But because I have a magic wand, I can do all those things.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you could do it immediately, right?
Right. I mean, immediate. Yeah, exactly. And I would just say just one other thing on this magic wand is that, so COVID has been a terrible tragedy for the world. And I think we all agree with that. The one positive thing about COVID is that schools, the concept of schools, which for a long, long time, the vast majority of people have said schools can't change fast. And what we've demonstrated with COVID is that the vast majority of schools can change fast. In fact, we did it in 2 to 4 weeks, and it was hard and it was not perfect. And there's going to be all sorts of learning loss, all sorts of things. But the fact is that we just flipped an entire global education system to being delivered to students remotely, if that was successful. Now, again, not all students received that. Some students just received packets. Some students didn't learn at all. But we showed that districts and schools and systems can move much faster to pivot. And my deepest hope is that as we emerge out of this in whenever, 6 to 12 months or whatever it is that we as educators take a deep look at saying, what did we learn from this process about our students' homes, about how students want more personalization, about who has access, who doesn't. What do we learn from that to pivot and help perhaps make some of that magic, as in our worlds, you and I think about the school redesign, creating schools that are good for all students, that engage all students, and that allow all students to make a difference with the requisite knowledge, skills, and dispositions that they need. So.
Yes to all of that. You are inspirational as always, Nate. And right away, I'm picking up things that I want to make sure that we're weaving in at Lead Prep. Thank you so much for your hard work. It's obvious that you're the head of innovation. You have all this creativity, and then you have the wherewithal to make it happen and the persistence. So thank you for sharing with our audience today, Nate.
Yeah, well, thank you, Maureen. And I'm just grateful for all the people that work with me and in partnership with me, including you all at Lead Prep. And there are a lot of great educators out there that want to make things happen in different ways. And you are part of that world at Lead Prep, and our world at Teton Science Schools is part of that, along with many, many others across the world. So just encouraging everybody who's listening to keep digging, keep asking hard questions, and keep finding the right partners to do the good work that needs to be done to help all students learn.
Absolutely. Thanks, Nate.
All right. Take care. Thanks so much.
The work that Nate is doing with the Teton Science Schools and the Place Network, incredible. Talk about synergy and talk about making learning real. There are some great takeaways from Nate's astute comments. We had talked already in episode 4 on the power of place with Nate's co-author, Tom Vander Ark. So we have a sense of the components in having place-based learning happen and a sense of the book. But Nate unpacked things from a practitioner perspective that is really powerful. I love how he talked about sticky learning. I hadn't heard that phrase before, but teachable moments and learning that kids remember 20 years from now. That's what we want. We want things that make an impact and not things that are memorized for tomorrow's test and forgotten by next week. We don't want it rote. We want it to be impactful. The part that really strikes me, there are so many parts, but I really like that Nate unpacked the 3 components needed to make learning powerful. We need the agency, community, and equity parts, all 3 in place. Agency for every learner to have a voice and choice and see that they can make a difference. We have to get away from textbooks. That gives no voice, no choice, and it doesn't engage kids. They just survive it. Community. Every learner belonging and feeling like a part of a community. Yes, we need that for all of humanity, especially for our youth. And equity. Every student having equal access to learning. I know that's not true in my home state of Washington. We look at graduation rates, and yes, we may be up to 80% in some statistics, but when you look at the Black, Latino, special education, and low-income students, they are still trailing. This is not equity. Something is still out of balance, and we can't have an institution that isn't striving for equity. So our graduation rate for Black students is at a 71% compared to 79%. And our special needs graduation rate, 59%. Not okay. I really appreciate that Nate talked about engagement in our graduates. It's not enough for our students to graduate. We want to make sure that they felt engaged. And engagement is just a measurement of how involved, enthusiastic, and committed someone is to an organization. And the Gallup poll has done a lot of research on this with students. Engaged students are 2.5 times more likely to say they get excellent grades and do well in school. And they are 4.5 times more likely to be hopeful about the future than their actively disengaged peers. This is important. We also see that engagement drops. Nearly 3/4 of 5th graders are highly engaged, but gradually and steadily that decline happens from 5th through 10th grade. We can't have that. It also helps engagement if we have students who really feel like they're getting to play to their strengths, and there's at least one teacher that makes the student feel excited about the future. Those 2 features result in students being 30 times as likely to be engaged at school compared to students who strongly disagreed on those 2 components. So we need graduates with learning hard and soft skills, the ability to manage projects, and create results. Authentic place-based learning makes that happen and engages students. As Nate said, the pandemic shows that education can shift rapidly. No excuses, fellow educators. We need to keep shifting until we have agency, community, equity, learning and engagement for all our students. I know how challenging it is to make changes inside your own school or community. I've spent years working with schools around the world on creating learner-centered programs, and it always struck me how much schools were able to get done with the right tools and guidance. If you're ready to make changes like this in your own school, let's talk and put together an action plan. Visit educationevolution.org/consult for a free 15-minute call, and let's see if we're a good fit for more work together. Education Evolution listeners, you are the ones to ensure we create classrooms where each student is seen, heard, valued, and thriving. We need you. Let's go out and reach every student today. Leaving a rating and review for this podcast lets others know that you find it of value. and gets it in the earbuds of more educational leaders like you. Thank you for listening. Signing off, I am Maureen O'Shaughnessy, your partner in boldly reimagining education.